Hi, I'm Glenn Huey, Senior Editor with Popular Woodworking and Woodworking magazines. Throughout the years, I've built many projects for the magazines, and one of the areas I've become known for is how I make my finishes really stand out, no matter where the project is going to go. So whether you're working in figured woods, such as tiger maple or flame birch, or whether you're working in straight everyday hardwoods, such as mahogany, walnut, and cherry, I'm going to take you through this DVD and show you how you can make your finishes pop. Now, the project we're going to finish in this DVD is a Massachusetts tiger maple high chest of drawers. The neat thing is we're going to apply an aniline dye stain to really make the grain pop. But the first step in finishing actually begins with your project. You have to get the project prepared right in order for the dye to work the way it's supposed to work. And that means we have a couple things we have to do. The first we have to do is to sand to 180 grit. Now, we need to make sure to walk through each grit as you go. We don't want to skip grits from 120 to 180. You want to go 120, 150, 180, and finish at the 180 area. The next thing we have to do, and this is a place where most people miss, is we have to take some paper and knock down the sharp edges on our project. Those edges are very, very sharp at this point, and once the stain is applied or the dye is applied and the finish, that's the first place that they get knocked when you move it around the house. So we want to take a piece of 120 grit, I just have an old sanding belt here, and go through and really knock the corners down. Now, you're not trying to round them over. What you're really trying to do is just take that sharp point off of them, and then you'll be ready to go. Now, that's not the end. Before we can actually mix up our dye and use it, we have one more step to have to work through. And what we're going to do is add a coat of water to our project. Now, I'm just going to take a rag that's soaked in water, just squeeze it out a little bit, and then just go right onto your project and add a coat of water. You can see what's going to happen here. As we add this water, it's actually going to raise the grain. And by raising the grain and letting it dry and then knocking it back down with 180, we've got one layer of that already done. So when we do apply our stain, because it's water-based, it's not going to have the same effect. It's not going to raise the grain as much. Now, it's still going to raise the grain, but it's not going to do it as much. So once we get this entirely wet, just on the surface, then I'm going to allow it to dry, and I'm going to come back with 180 grit paper one more time and knock everything down. Once we do that, it's on to the aniline dye. Now, to add color to the project, we're going to use an aniline dye. And aniline dyes come in three different kinds. There's an alcohol base, oil base, and water base. The alcohol base, unless you're spraying, is going to give you lap marks as you brush. So for me, I easily discount that one out of the package. Looking at the oil base is great. It works really fine. The difference or the problem that I see is the drying time. Once you get the piece stained or dyed, then you have a 24 to 48 hour period for allowing it to dry before you move back and start finishing. Now, the water base is a little bit different. The way the water base works, it's a 4 to 6 hour dry time, and it's easy to mix, easy to work with, and clean up afterwards is very simple. So that's where I go. It's a no-brainer for me. So looking at the type of dye, I use J.E. Moser's. I like the powder dye. It's easy to work with, mix. The storage on the shelf is great. One of the things that's also nice about the water base is that it is the least likely to fade in sunlight. Sunlight will fade the aniline dye. So let's go ahead and stay with that as well. So mixing it up, I'm going to start with one of the three sizes that are available. You can buy it in a 1 ounce, a 4 ounce, or an 8 ounce package. Now, let's talk about colors, because there's 50 different colors out there, maybe more. For me, I generally use 2 different colors for my maple projects and 3 different variations for the cherry. Now, don't let this stop you. Don't use just these colors. If you want to go out and experiment, feel free to do so. But looking at the colors that I use brown walnut and golden amber maple for my maple projects. Started originally with golden amber maple. Over the years, I got to looking at it, I thought it looked a little golden, so I wanted to tone it down a little bit. So what I did is I mixed up brown walnut and mixed 50-50 brown walnut and golden amber maple. So that's one of the key things with this dye, is that you can mix and match to bring them down to a specific color that you're looking for. Now on the cherry side, I use 3 different kinds, 3 different colors. The first is a dark antique Sheridan, which is a browner side of the cherry. The other 2 are early American cherry and dark wine cherry. Those 2 are very much on the red shades of cherry. I like my projects to be a little warmer, so I tend to use the dark antique Sheridan, which is actually listed as a mahogany dye, but I use it on cherry for most of my projects. Now, the cool thing about this, and we're back to this water idea, everything's going to mix in water. I get the question, do I need distilled water? Or can I use water straight out of the tap? Well, my idea is try your tap water. See how it works, and if you're happy with it on a couple samples, then go for it. And if you think there's a problem in it, you get a variation in color because you have minerals in your water, then use the distilled water. I use tap water straight out of my kitchen. So at that point, we're ready to mix the dye, and let's take a look at that procedure. To begin mixing the dye, you want to bring 4 cups of water to almost a boil. When you see the bubbles at the bottom and they start coming up and just breaking the top surface, then you know your temperature is about right. Now, to mix the stain, there's a real scientific formula that we use. We use 1 ounce of powder to the 4 cups of water that we have heating up. Now, if you don't have your dye in a 1 ounce container, then I got a real scientific way of doing that as well. I use a standard coffee scoop. No big deal there, that's about 1 ounce. So you just want to reach into your container, get you a level ounce, and then from there we dump it right into our opaque jug. Now you notice the jug, it is not clear. The idea is that you want to have an opaque jug in order to reduce that sunlight hitting or the light hitting and fading the dye. So once that dye is inside our jug, all we need to do is add our water when the temperature comes up and we're ready to go. Now it doesn't get much easier than that. Make sure you put the lid on and then give it a good shake. Notice how the jug's swelling up? Well, you want to release that pressure just a little bit and let it come back down. I'll run through that process 2 or 3 times. After that, you just want to set the dye aside a little bit and let it cool down before we go to use it. All right, now that our dye is cooled down a little bit, we're going to go ahead and mix the two. We're going to use part golden amber maple and part brown walnut on our high chest. Now the idea here is to put them into liquid forms first and then mix the 2 liquids. It's a lot easier than trying to measure out and mix the powders. So I've already got 8 ounces of the golden amber maple in our cup, and now I'm going to go ahead and add the equal amount of brown walnut. The idea behind equal amounts is it's a totally repeatable, and if you have to mix up more, you certainly are able to do so. I'm going to dump this in. We're going to stir things up a little bit and make sure that we get them all mixed well, and then we're ready to go stain the drawers. I stain the drawers by hand, but I'll use an HVLP spray system on the rest of the chest. Begin on the inside lip of the drawer. Add dye to the lip and also to the top edge of the drawer front. That's the area that will be seen when the drawer is opened. One thing about aniline dye is that you want to flood the piece to allow the dye to penetrate into the figured areas. When we move to the side, you'll again want to cover the lip area, but I also come up and stain the dovetails. Make sure that you get a nice solid even coat. We do the same on the opposite end. You'll want to stain the bottom edge of the drawer as well. All of these areas are what is seen when the drawers are either open or partly opened on the finished chest, and you want to make sure that they are thoroughly covered. After the lip portion of the drawer is covered, move to the front face of the drawer. The first thing I want to do is make sure that I get all the crevices of the lipped moldings covered. Now we can stain the face of the drawer. The same holds true here with the drawers as it does when spraying the chest. Make sure you flood the piece entirely. You want the wood to stay completely wet for about 5 minutes, and then we'll wipe off the excess. I like to say if you don't have any excess to wipe off, you didn't get enough stain put on. So make sure it is loaded with stain. When finishing drawers, I'll often stain the first drawer like I did here, and then move on to the second. Once the second drawer is stained, I'll come back to the first drawer and put a whole other coat of stain on the face only. That ensures I get a nice load of dye applied and allows the time needed to soak down into the figure of the wood. After we put our second coat on, we'll let it set for another 5 minutes and wipe off the excess. The great thing about water-based aniline dye when you're brushing is that you'll see how I won't be getting any lap marks. The dye blends perfectly as it's absorbed into the wood. At this point, we'll use a cloth to wipe off the excess. Make sure you get down into all the edges of the molded areas. So here's what our finished drawers look like when they're stained. Now when I applied the dye to the drawers, you notice I did it by hand with a brush and I only did the front. The reason is I don't want to get a bunch of dye on the inside of the drawers or miscolor the drawers at all. I want that to stay natural. So I'm going to always do those by hand. But when it comes to the other part, to the large case piece like we've got going on this project, I'm going to turn to my sprayer. Now the reason is it can put on a lot of material fast. Now that won't make a huge difference with the dye because you can apply that by hand quick enough. Where that really comes in and makes a huge difference is when you get to the top coats. Those are going to go on so much smoother, so much nicer. It's going to cut down your sanding. It's worth the money to invest in a good sprayer. All right, so here's the thing. You're saying, hey, sprayer, that means I have all the cleanup to do. Don't let the cleanup be a big hassle for you because all you have to do is run a little bit of solvent through to clean the gun. So for instance, if I'm spraying shellac and I want to clean my gun, I'll take some denatured alcohol, run through it a couple times just to clean things up. Just put the gun away and let it go. On the water-based product, it's even easier. You go right to the tap, get water, run some water through the gun, make sure it's all cleaned up, and do that until you're not getting any kind of color with that water because the aniline dye will continue to color. But do this, once you're done running the water through it, run a little bit of denatured alcohol through it too because the alcohol grabs the water molecules and that'll keep the inside of your gun from rusting. So HVLP is the way to go. So let's go ahead and get started on that case piece. To get started, I'm going to make sure to cover all the bottom edges before moving on to dye everything else. Just like with the drawers, it's important to keep the outside of the piece wet for about 5 minutes, even if it means applying a second coat. Notice I'm using a Lazy Susan base. This allows me to turn the piece while spraying and not create issues by dragging the hose around the project. Because you're going to get some dye on the inside of the case anyway, I take the time to spray the interior just to eliminate any streaks. The outsides have already absorbed most of the stain, so I'm going to apply a second coat. It's important to keep these parts flooded. I believe I have the piece drenched enough, but I'm going to let the dye soak into the figured grain. And I'm going to keep an eye on it, because if I need to, I'll come back and spray any areas that look dry. I'll let this sit for 5 to 10 minutes before I wipe it down. Once we've let the stain soak into the grain for 5 to 10 minutes, we're just going to go back and wipe away any of the excess. Make sure to wipe any horizontal surfaces where the dye might pool, and then to get into all the crevices. We'll now let the piece dry for 24 hours. If you're in a rush, you can get by with 4 to 5 hour window. On a few occasions, I've found myself using a blow dryer to speed the process. Once the stain is dry, we need to go ahead and knock down the sanding. I use these sponges that are super fine or very fine, and on the flat surface areas. And any place you have moldings, I like these Scotch-Brite style pads because they have a tendency not to knock off your edges. So once we get that done, we're going to do something now that's going to highlight our striping in the tiger maple. And I do this step for any piece where I use a figured woods. Now, if it's an ordinary cherry or a straight maple, there's no need to add this step to it. But this is boiled linseed oil straight from the can available at the hardware store. And we're going to apply a coat of that over the entire surface. What we want to do is put it on and keep it wet for about 5 minutes or so, and then come back and wipe off any excess. Now what happens is, as it is going in and drying into the piece and filling into the piece, it's going down into the stripe areas, because that's the softer area. That's the area that everything's going to sink into or soak into. That's what highlights this grain. So you want to make sure to get it on nice and tight and nice and heavy, and make sure that you cover it completely. Keep it wet for about 5 minutes and then wipe away the excess. Now you can see how we've got this applied. You want to do this for any area that's on the exterior of your piece. You don't need to worry about doing the inside. Make sure to do your drawer fronts and all your exterior on the top and lower section. And don't forget those little drop finials. They need to be done as well. Now as you look here at this piece, you can see how we're kind of soaking into the area where it's heavy in the stripe. That's what we're talking about making sure that it stays covered for a 5-minute period or so. You might have to go back and do this a couple different times, but once you've got it on there for about 5 minutes, let it sit, and then we're ready to wipe away the excess. Now we've allowed our oil to set on here and kept it wet for 5 minutes or so, and then we let it sit just a little bit longer. You can see we still have some areas that are a little dry, but for the most part we've got this pretty well saturated. And now it just comes time to wipe it clean. So you just want to take a rag and clean it up and wipe everything down dry. And it's going to require to set about 24 to 48 hours. But the one thing that is important to do after you do this are these rags. Rags with boiled linseed oil on them are very combustible. You need to make sure to properly dispose of these rags. Either lay them out on a concrete floor and allow them to dry and then properly dispose of them, or put them into a bucket of water so there's no chance that they're going to combust into a fire. They are very dangerous, so make sure to take care of them properly. So once you've got your entire piece oiled and everything set up and ready to go, you're going to have to let it dry for 24 to 48 hours, and then we'll come back and pick it up from there. Now while we're waiting for our boiled linseed oil to dry on the project, which is 24 to 48 hours, and if you can let it go for a week, you'd be better off, we're going to take advantage of the time to mix up our shellac. The thing about shellac is we're going to use it as our base coat over the top of the oil and the dye. But since we're also going to use it for our top coat, I'm going to go ahead and mix up a pretty good sized batch. If you take a look here, you'll see two different distinct shellac flakes, and these are both shellac flakes. This is a blonde shellac and this is garnet shellac. I'll use the garnet shellac pretty much on cherry projects and walnut projects when I'm trying to warm them up just a little bit, but 90% of my work's done right here with the blonde shellac flakes. All right, so now we have to talk about how to mix shellac. And when you talk shellac mixing, you're generally going to be talking about pound cuts. Now what that is I spray my shellac, so I like to spray a 1.5 pound cut. That means that I'm going to take 1.5 pounds of shellac and mix it into a gallon of denatured alcohol. Don't worry about anything special on my alcohol. I go to my home center store, my hardware store, and I buy it right off the shelf. Not a problem. So if I'm deciding that I want to brush this, then there's a couple things you need to do. First, you need to brush a 3-pound cut. That means you're going to take 3 pounds of shellac mixed into a gallon of denatured alcohol. And you need to get a good brush. I always say if you buy a 25-cent brush, you get a 25-cent job. So spend the money, get a nice brush, things are going to work better for you. And here's another point. A lot of times people are going to look at this whole process of mixing shellac and they're going to say, wow, that's just too much work, I don't want to fool around with it. Well, here's an answer. There's no problem going to your hardware store and picking up a can of pre-mixed shellac. There's nothing wrong with this product. I've been caught short times before and used it myself. But what you want to do is make sure you look for the manufacturer's date, which will be stamped on the top or on the bottom someplace. And you want to get a date that's less than 2 years old. The company sometimes says 3 years, but I try to stick with 2 years or less. That way I know it's going to be fresh. You got to make sure it's fresh, and then it'll work just like our other mix does, and you can use it the exact same way. Okay, so take a look at how we're going to mix this. We're going to start with 24 ounces of denatured alcohol in my jar, and that's been measured out. All right. Then what I've got here is 4 ounces of shellac flakes. It's measured out and weighed, so I know that it's exactly the 4 ounces. Now, you don't have to be that particular. You could be off a little bit. It's not going to matter. But a hint, if you want to get this to dissolve a little faster, you can see the way the flakes are. If you'll crunch those flakes up into smaller pieces, they'll dissolve in the alcohol. But whether you do that or not, the only thing you really need to do is dump the two together. And we're making shellac. Now, from here, you have to agitate this or stir this and keep it all in suspension. And one of the things you'll see, I'm using a glass jar, and I really like the glass jar because if I happen to be walking past this in my shop and I can tell that the shellac is all settled down to the bottom, then I know it's time for me to come over and stir it. You're going to have to stir it every once in a while just to keep it all suspended and all moving along. The more you stir, the faster it's going to dissolve. So once this all gets dissolved and ready to go, at that point we'll be ready to spray. Now the big question on shellac is how much should you mix up? What are you going to need for your project? And if we take a look at our sample project that we're working on, the Massachusetts High Chest, you're going to roughly on that piece use about 1.5 cups per coat. And since we're going to use it for the base coat, we're going to use it after glaze and then a couple 3 coats give or take for the top coat, you're going to be looking at 5 to 6 coatings. So at that point you're going to need 1.5 times 5 or 6 coats, which is roughly going to put you in the area of needing close to a half a gallon. So if you want to mix it all up at one time, that's great, go ahead and do so. If you want to work independently or kind of step up to it, that's a good idea. And here's why it's a good idea. If you're spraying, then you're going to use a gun, and that gun cup is going to be made out of aluminum. You don't want to have your shellac stay in that gun for an extended period of time, overnight, a couple days, because the shellac and the aluminum will react together and your shellac will get to the point where it doesn't dry. So only work in the gun what you need to use for those spray coats, give or take. At the end of the day, pour your gun back into the pot that you're mixing all your shellac in. So that's a great way to go about it and save the product and know that it's fresh and good each time you go to use it. The other thing we want to talk about is the shelf life of shellac. So you're going to mix all this up and you don't decide you're not going to have time to use it all. How much time can you go? This is a very fresh product, and the fresher you spray it, the better. That's why you want to mix flakes and go right to the project. But if you find yourself with it and you're looking at the freshness of it and wondering about it, when we mix it this way, we generally are looking at about a 6-month period. Anything after 6 months, I probably would pour out and go ahead and mix up new shellac and start my project right there, because you don't want to go too much past that. What happens to shellac is it eventually starts to not dry, and once it gets gummy, it's hard to get off your project. So we'll mix this up. We're going to wait for our oil to all dry. We'll dump it into our gun and we'll get started on that first coat. So here you can see that the shellac flakes have all settled right down at the bottom. That's when you know it's time to come in and agitate it again. Now that we have our shellac mixed and the boiled linseed oil is dry on our project, we need to go ahead and get ready for the first coat of shellac. But before we do that, we have to take an abrasive pad and go over the entire project. What the abrasive pad's going to do is pull off any dust nibs, any stuff that may have fallen into the oil and been trapped there as the project was drying. The next thing we want to do is, as we use our shellac, we're going to pour it through this paper filter. It's a simple paper filter purchased at any automotive store or some of the hardware stores. The reason for the filter is the fact that if there's any undissolved product that's down in there, the shellac flakes that didn't dissolve, you want to catch those in the filter so they don't get into your gun. From there, we're ready to do the first coat of shellac. Now, with your first coat of shellac on, you want to make sure whether you brush it or whether you spray it, you get a nice even coat on, nice and heavy, no runs. And then once it's dry, in about 4 to 5 hours, you want to sand that thoroughly with a 320 or a 400 grit sandpaper. Now, as you start to sand, if your sandpaper kind of drags and it's a little tough, then your shellac's not dry. Give it a little bit more time and let it go. Because once you get to the shellac and you're sanding and it actually is dry, it'll powder up to a nice white powder and be really easy to sand. Once you get that coat on and get the piece thoroughly sanded, at that point, we're ready for the glaze, and that's what's next. At this point, we've applied our sealing coat of shellac to both the bottom and the top portions of the chest. But you'll notice a difference between the two. We've applied the shellac to the top, and we've also added a coat of glaze. Glaze is simply a layer that's applied between two coats of finish. If it was put onto raw wood, it would be considered a stain. But in this case, since it's trapped between two coats of shellac, it's called a glaze. What the glaze does is add about 50 years of age to the piece. It collects in small crevices and gives you an even tonal appearance on the surface of the chest.
Now we're ready to go ahead and apply the glaze to the lower section. I've sanded the piece with 320 grit sandpaper and wiped it off to dust all the excess shellac off of it. Now the thing that you'll notice, a couple different things. I've got the drawers in and I've got them tight. So what happens when I spray the glaze is it's just going to go between. It's not going to work itself down behind the drawer edge or the lip of the drawer. And that's fine with me, because what we're doing is simulating age. And if they're doing that, generally behind those areas you wouldn't have the same aging that you would on the outer side. So we're going to apply the glaze just over the top of this, but when we get to the point where we're removing the glaze or wiping the excess off, you want to make sure to pull those drawers out and clean up that area. The other thing that's important here is I've taken a piece of cardboard and cut it into the top section. Now, it's important because as we spray, we don't want to fill up the inside of our drawers. Our drawers stay natural. We don't put any finish on them, so we don't want to get overspray into there. So just simply a piece of cardboard on top and you're ready to go.
I'm using a heavy-bodied glaze made specifically as a glaze. You can use any oil-based stain from your local hardware store, but I prefer the thicker glaze. This is an oil-based product, so you'll need to clean your spray gun with mineral spirits. When spraying, the glaze is almost like a thick paint. Apply a nice even coat all the way around the project. Later on, as the glaze dries, you'll notice it'll flash off or become white in appearance. The glaze will dull from a high sheen. This tells us the glaze is ready to wipe off.
Now, once the glaze has flashed off, and by that I mean if you look in this area right here, you can kind of see a dull whitish effect, where down here you can still see that it's kind of on the wet side. Once it's gotten to this place where it has flashed off, we can go ahead and wipe down. What's going to happen is you're going to notice your moldings for the most part are going to flash off first. and then you can kind of check everything all over. It's not going to get to the point where it's all flashed off at the same time. So you're going to have some areas that have and some areas that haven't as you go to white. The idea of the glaze is to get into the small cracks and crevices. That's what adds the age. So right here along the thumbnail of the drawer, up here at the ledge where our molding hits the top rail of our lower section, especially right around the areas of the knee, right in this area is where this glaze is going to stay because it's impossible to wipe it all out. That's what you're looking for, areas like that. And all these different spots are going to add the glaze. That's going to add some age and some character to the piece, as well as tone change the entire piece so it all kind of blends together. And that's what we're looking for. So once we get to this point, we're going to go ahead and wipe the piece down completely, and we'll let you see what it looks like when it's cleaned up. As you begin wiping the glaze off, if you find that it's drying a little faster than you can wipe it off, the glaze that we're using that you'll find on a resource page that's included with this DVD, you can clean up using mineral spirits. So if you find it getting away from you, just put a little mineral spirits on your rag and go ahead and wipe over that area. That'll soften it back up and let you work on it again. Now when we put the glaze on, we talked about having the drawers in tight because we didn't want to get the glaze behind the lip of the drawer. And if you look here at the center drawer, you can see what I'm talking about. You can see here that it's actually ran down a little bit, but you might notice a real faint line right around the edges of the drawers. And that's what we're looking to do. We want to make sure that that's there. Now you don't want to leave it that rough. You're going to want to take some time and just kind of blend this away. But you want to make sure that you have less of it around the inside than you do on the outside area. So that helps again with the age appearance. So wipe it down good with your rags. Make sure to carefully take care of the rags to dispose of them properly because again this is an oil-based product that needs to have the rags taken care of properly. Dry them completely and discard them or put them in a bucket of water to soak them to keep them from being flammable. And wipe the piece down completely. Take one clean dry rag when you're done. Go over the entire piece one more time. Then it has to sit for 48 hours to allow it to dry completely before we move on to the shellac top coats. Now we've allowed the glazing to dry for 48 hours as well, so it's all set. And now we're going to complete what actually makes this a glaze. We're going to start top coating it again with shellac in order to base it in. Now one of the reasons I use shellac is because it's a cover or a coat for any kind of oil finish, any stain. Whatever you're using, shellac can go in and do a top coat on it and seal that product in. So that's the reason we're using shellac for this purpose. And one of the things you'll notice here as I start to work on this is that I've actually pulled the drawers out just even with the dovetails. The reason I'm doing this is I want to make sure when I spray down through here that I also cut the inside edge of the drawer, get it coated with shellac as well. So from here we're going to blow a couple coats on here. Now my process again would be if I'm going to spray, which I'm doing in this case, I'm spraying a 1.5 pound cut. I'm going to spray 2 coats on, take a look at it. If I get the coverage that I want, at that point I'm going to sand it real good and start the final phase of rubbing it out. Now, if I was brushing this, I'd be brushing it on with a 3 pound cut, and at that point you want to brush on a coat, let it dry, sand it really well, and then brush on another coat, then check to see where you're at. And one of the things that's important to remember when you're brushing on the shellac, the better quality brush, the better job you're going to get on brushing your shellac out. So if you're going to do that, spend some money on a nice brush. It'll help you out in the long run. So let's put a couple coats on here. We'll let it dry in between. We'll come back, take a look at it at that point. Once you've applied a number of coats of shellac in order to bring the finish up to a nice thickness so you can work from there, you'll notice that the shellac has a real high sheen to it, and that you're going to want to knock down. There's a couple ways to take care of it. The first and easiest is probably just to use 4/0 steel wool to go ahead and rub the piece out, back and forth until you knock the sheen down. You want to make sure not to rub through your finish, but level everything down and pull the sheen off. Now to help you out with that, sometimes I use a Beelin's wool lube, and what this does is helps to cut the shellac and smooth things down, and it lets you rub it out a little faster. Now one thing that I happen to be noticing now when I talk to more and more woodworkers is they're not rubbing out the piece at the very end. What they're doing is, instead of rubbing the shellac, they're sanding it very well with a 320 or a 400 paper until they get a nice smooth surface. And then they're putting a coat or 2 coats of a wiping varnish with a dull rubbed effect or a low sheen to it. That's another way you can take care of it. Either method you choose, you want to rub out the entire piece, and then we'll set up and ready to put the hardware on.
Well, there you go. You've seen the entire process. It's easy to do, it's repeatable, and I know that if you follow these instructions and follow along as I did in the DVD, that you too will have fantastic results.
We're going to mix up our own oil varnish finish, and it's a real easy method. It's linseed oil, boiled linseed oil, spar varnish, and turpentine. And I mentioned boiled linseed oil for a reason. If you use raw linseed oil, you're going to have a really hard time getting this to dry for you. We're going to mix in equal portions, 1/3, 1/3, and 1/3 as I have them set out here. The thing to remember is this is not a critical measurement. If you're a little strong on the turpentine or a little weak on one of the other two, it's not really that technical. The idea here is that these are the 2 finishes that we're going to use to really bring up the sheen on our table and give us the protection we need. The turpentine is there to thin the process so it soaks into the wood on the very first coat. So as you mix this, I like to try to mix enough for about 1.5 coats worth of finish. On our table that we're working on, if you would mix 1/3 of a cup of each of these, that's going to give you enough for the first coat and a little bit more. And the reason I like to do a little bit more is after we do the first coat, when we go to mix up some more finish, we're going to remove the turpentine completely from the process and simply use the linseed oil and the spar varnish. The reason being, on the first coat we already have got the finish soaked down into our grain. And from there we want to use these 2 to just build the finish so we get a nice sheen. On coats number 2 through 4, then this would be the process to use. After we've made the oil varnish mixture, we're going to go ahead and apply it. We're going to do it right here at the top only, but it applies to the entire piece in the same fashion. What we're going to do is brush it on, and I want to put a nice even coat on it, but I want to make sure that I keep it wet for the first 5 minutes or so. And even if you have to go back and continue to put more on, you need to do so. The idea is keep it wet for the first 5 minutes. It's soaking into the wood, and it's allowing it to get down into the pores, which is what you really want it to do. Now, as this sits for a little bit, you'll be able to see it start drying out in different areas, and that's what we want to pay attention to. But a little tip right here. If you want to continue this and get it to darken down rather quickly, every day that you can after you apply the first coat of oil varnish, put it out in the sunlight. I once did a table for a customer that I treated in that fashion, and they wondered how many days ago I must have built it because it had already reached a nice patina. So let's make sure to keep this wet, and then after 5 minutes of keeping it wet, we'll come back and we'll wipe off the excess. As we get going a little bit further here, I want to point out something else. You can see we've actually put this piece down on a plastic trash bag. It's a great way to keep all the finish off of your bench. It also allows you to collect up everything in one swoop at the end and throw it away. The other thing I want to point out right here is the areas that you see the little dried pieces coming in. This is the areas that we're talking about that we want to keep wet for the 5-minute period prior to wiping it down and letting it dry overnight. So I'm going to go ahead and add a little bit more finish and make sure to keep these areas nice and wet. and we'll let it dry from there. Our 5 minutes are up and we've kept the piece wet for that amount of time. We've got a good soaking in there for the first coat of the oil varnish. Now it's time to go ahead and remove it. I've put on rubber gloves because I want to keep all the finish off of my hands. Now all we need to do is wipe the piece clean. Let that dry for 24 hours or so and we can put on another couple coats. 3 to 4 coats usually brings this up to the point where it's got a nice sheen on it and it's got great water protection, so you can go ahead and use this piece every day. Another thing to remember is because of the use of the oil in these regs, you need to properly dispose of those, so make sure that becomes a high priority in your wood shop. When you start applying the finish to your drawer, try to keep it just on the drawer front. You don't want to have runs and drips down on the body of your drawer. We want that to stay natural. What will happen then is over the time your great-grandkids will be able to find your piece and it'll have that natural patina that they all talk about in the antique world. So when you get through with the first coat and we start applying the second and third and fourth coats, the thing to come up with is on the finish, instead of letting it sit for the 5 minutes or so like we did on the first coat, we want to let the second coats and beyond that sit until they become a little tacky. What we're looking for here is something about the consistency of honey. Once you achieve that as it's drying, then you want to go ahead and take your clean rag and wipe clean. Now, as you're wiping away the finish, don't be upset if you happen to miss a place, because if you come back to the next coat and you find a spot that's rough, using some steel wool or some light fine sandpaper, just go over that surface and smooth it back down again and go ahead with your next coat. That's one of the great things about this finish. It's something that you can take care of and you don't have to worry about getting any particles in. You just come back and clean it up and start your next coat. Once you've applied all the oil varnish and it's had a good 24 to 48 hours to dry, a good coat of paste wax, that's all that's needed, and that'll bring the moisture protection right up for you. Just apply it, let it sit till it dries a little bit, and wipe it away with a clean cloth.